Lisa Faith Phillips. Faith in Love.
My middle name, Faith, I was a little embarrassed about when I was young. It seemed a little lame and kind of religious. I was named after my mother's family friend, Faith, who lived in New York City and was very wealthy. She had inherited money from 7 uncles who had all died childless. Now, when I was young, she would send me postcards from around the world travels, Afghanistan, China, Thailand, and I would lovingly paste them in a photo album, thinking about traveling with her someday in the future. Now, Faith went to Wellesley, class of 1919. So I thought, I want to go to Wellesley College. But my father told me because I was a girl, I would get married and a man would take care of me. So I didn't need money for college. And I began to think, but how can I go to college? I want to go to college. I applied to Wellesley College and was accepted. Faith, who I had never met at that point, sent me money to pay for the first year. She sent me money for the second year and the third year, and in the end, she paid for all 4 years of Wellesley College. She truly was a fairy godmother that opened up the world to me. But the first time I met her was my freshman year at Wellesley. I took the train down to New York City for Thanksgiving weekend. That weekend, I would fall in love with Faith, New York City, and James. Faith was still, I thought, beautiful at 76, with fine high cheekbones, delicately powdered skin, and piercing blue eyes that drew me in. She told me about her life. In the 20s, she had been one of the first women pilots. In the 30s, she had settled in France and started an orphanage in the south of France. After World War II, she smuggled back 25 orphans to New York and set them up for life in the United States. After the war, she lied about her age and became a nurse and worked for 20 years at Bellevue Hospital. She was amazing. I loved this woman. She took me to my first Broadway musical. We sat in the front row. From the first moment, I was in love with the musical. That first line, "There's a bright golden haze on the meadow." That same weekend, my roommate from Wellesley, who was a bit rebellious, she could be seen standing in the Wellesley dorm, twirling tassels on her humongous breasts in opposite directions. This got her invited to large concerts and backstage passes, and she often went home with the lead singer of the band. She was also visiting New York that weekend, and she wanted me to meet her latest boyfriend, rock and roller Joey Ramone. We went down to Max's Kansas City to meet Joey. Max's Kansas City was already legendary, but it didn't look like much. It had like red tablecloths and Formica booths, but there was Andy Warhol sitting in the back. Joey Ramone was 6'6" and looked like a praying mantis, but pale, like his skin had never seen the sun. Black dyed hair flopped over his face and his purple sunglasses that he never took off even in the dark. His lips were big, as if they were too large for his face. And he had with him the skull of a small animal, possibly a dog. And he stroked it lovingly, introducing it as my pet. Conversation was difficult. He took a swig of a beer and announced, "I live on beer and potato chips." Years later, when he died of lymphatic cancer, I wondered about his dietary choices. But that night, I was thrilled to be invited along when we went down to CBGB's, and he arrived like a conquering hero and got up on stage and was transformed. 24 hours a day. I want to be sedated. Nothing to do, nowhere to go. I want to be sedated. So different from my style. Good morning, it's great. And though my friend said, I love him, I could see she was attracted to the magic of being with a rock and roll star. And I was in love with being invited along. I called James, an older brother of a friend of mine from Findlay, Ohio. James was dashing and witty, and at 28, an editor at Random House. I invited him over to meet us at CBGB's, hoping it would make me seem cooler than I was. He had the life I wanted, a whirlwind of invitations to the hottest parties, openings, art readings, and I just thought if I could have his life, that would be the end-all and be-all. At CBGB's, we stayed until the end. At 2 a.m, we fell out onto the street. Then it was a deserted Bowery, except for some homeless people in cardboard boxes. I felt afraid. I had heard so much about the murders in New York City. But James took my hand, and we ran around to his loft around the corner. And we made mad, passionate love. And I discovered that my entire body was an erogenous zone, especially my right ear. Oh, but I love James, and when I got back to Wellesley College, I wrote him a romantic letter, picturing romantic weekends to come. And he wrote me back a nice note, letting me down. And I thought to myself, in the future, I'll go back to New York City, and I'll be with Faith, and I'll become friends with James, and we'll go to the hottest openings and parties and readings. I go to Paris for my junior year, and I get to see Faith there. She made it all possible. We share our love of that city. But when I'm at graduate school at the London School of Economics, my mother calls. Faith has been murdered. There was a forced entry in her Upper East Side apartment. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. She was raped and stabbed 18 times. She was 81 years old. The doorman said he'd been called away for delivery. The crime was never solved. I began to use my middle name. I suddenly was Lisa Faith Phillips, to honor her, to Faith. I stayed in Europe because I couldn't face coming back to the United States. I traveled. I ended up in Barcelona. Europe seemed so civilized compared to the violence of the United States. When I finally came back to New York City to live, I looked forward to seeing James again. I called his number. It had been disconnected. I called his brother. His brother told me James was dying. They were telling people it was cancer, but it was AIDS. In a few short months, he had gone from being a vibrant, beautiful man to being a living skeleton with great sores all over his body. He was refusing to see anyone but family. His father was there by his side, but his mother refused to see him. She couldn't accept that he had been bisexual. I felt like Marius in Les Mis. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Empty chairs at empty tables. My friends are dead and gone. I loved the theater. The gayer, the better. When I grew up in Findlay, Ohio, I had written my first play in the 3rd grade, and I realized these were my people. So I lost many friends over the next 10 years. Even my neighbor in the East Village, a woman, had been diagnosed. She didn't know how she got it. She had had sex with so many men before AIDS was even known about. I helped her as she succumbed to dementia and waited for a bed at a hospice center where there were no beds.